Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video of History Valley Podcast. Today I'm joined by Professor James Crossley. He co-authored Jesus, a Life in Class Conflict with Professor Robert J. Miles. And today we're going to be discussing his thoughts on the historical Jesus and the methodology he uses to reconstruct the historical Jesus and what kind of person he thinks Jesus was. So welcome to the show, James.
Pleasure to be here.
And thank you for joining me. All right, let's get right into it. So, how do you go about reconstructing the historical Jesus? And could you describe the methodology you use in that process?
Well, I mean, just to go back a bit further on this, is I've bought into quite heavily the idea that the traditional criteria for authenticity are not completely dead, but they're more or less, they're of minimal use for reconstructing Jesus. So we could say something like multiple attestation, something that's attested in sources and forms across the Synoptic, say, or if you want to include John and Thomas, do so. At best takes you back to pre-gospel material, pre-gospel tradition, and and that's fine by me. I mean, I don't think it doesn't prove anything that the historical Jesus did or didn't do something with. I mean, for a start, with multiple attestation, you've got miracles. Now, I don't think for 1 minute miracles were being performed in the strong supernatural sense, but I could quite happily accept that ideas about Jesus as a miraculous figure were circulating very early, possibly during his life, for all I know. But it takes us back to pre-gospel tradition. Is the idea, and that's about as far as I go with that. Something like the criterion of embarrassment. Likewise, I mean, maybe there's stuff in there that they wouldn't have invented a gospel writer. I think you can make that case in one or two instances, but the idea, I mean, something like Mark's gospel isn't embarrassed by what happened in the return to Nazareth, for instance. He doesn't seem to be particularly embarrassed by the baptism of Jesus. Would he have made them up? I guess there's a case to be made that he might not, but again, it's limited. I mean, embarrassment's in the eye of the embarrassed, so to speak. And if Mark doesn't show any signs of embarrassment, is that embarrassment? Now, we could say that Matthew might be embarrassed by a tradition Mark has, or John's embarrassed by a tradition the Synoptics have, or whatever, but that's not taking us back to the historical Jesus necessarily. So, for these reasons and plenty of others, I'm a bit skeptical about the traditional criteria. But what I think we can do is if we start, we can make the case for general ideas being present in Galilee, in Judea, around the time of Jesus, in that kind of cultural setting that were perhaps different from what would happen in 40s, 50s, 60s. I'll just call it Christianity for convenience. That we can start talking about themes and issues that might be early. I can't prove whether the stuff went back to historical Jesus or not, but I think I can make a case for certain ideas and themes and issues being present in Galilee around the time of Jesus. So, I mean, I can give examples, and let me give one, for instance. Jesus in the law is one of interest to me. So there's Sabbath disputes in Mark's Gospel, and particularly in Mark 2:23 through to 28, and the plucking of the grain on the Sabbath, and the hand washing dispute in Mark 7. Did these events happen in the life of Jesus? I don't know. But do these ideas reflect disputes and discussions that are more typical of debates that are of less interest, let's say, to the emerging Christian movement? I think you can make that case. And there's certain assumptions in Mark's Gospels, in Mark 2 and Mark 7, about, I think, the validity of the law. And these are debates over nuances and interpretation and things like that. And I think we can, with a bit more detail and so on, we can start making the case that this material reflects early material that would be something we might find in Judea or Galilee around the time of Jesus. So I prefer to work in terms of generalization. I can expand on that, by the way. I mean, I appreciate that. That's just a general explanation of the kind of things that I do, that we do in the book. But I think we have to work in terms of general statements about themes and topics that could be earlier than stuff that, say, like I and the Father are one in John's Gospel or something like that. So I think we can. It's almost like a chronology of ideas. When do these ideas happen? When were these ideas likely to have started to emerge and things like that? So I'm quite skeptical about proving and even sometimes disproving whether something goes back to Jesus or not. But I'm quite comfortable with the idea that these ideas and themes are earlier than others, if that makes sense.
It is often thought that the Gospels are unreliable and cannot tell us much about the historical Jesus. How do you go about sifting through the Gospels to decipher what is historically reliable and not reliable in the Gospels?
Well, again, I would reframe the question. What do I think could reasonably be seen as coming from an earlier tradition associated particularly with Galilee, Judea, that part of the world, and what would be fairly obviously not? Now, sometimes you get nice clear-cut examples, I think. So take something like Mark 13 and the prediction of the fall of the temple, the return of Jesus coming in the clouds of heaven, or Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven, at least. I mean, this looks fairly clearly like it's written up in light of later events that we know happened in Christian origins. So we can make a case that this stuff is later than Jesus. We could, I think John's Gospel is a very good example. So why is Jesus? What's the reason for putting Jesus to death in John's Gospel? Well, it's the raising of Lazarus in John 11. Compare that with the Synoptics, where it's a disturbance in the temple. Now, I'm not saying that I can prove that the disturbance in the temple happened, but I can say that there's more chance of that being an early tradition associated with the historical Jesus than something like the raising of Lazarus as the cause of Jesus' death, or some of the extremely high claims about Jesus in John's Gospel. I mentioned before things like I and the Father are one, the dispute over the Sabbath in John 5 ends in some pretty elevated Christological disputes with the Jews, as John puts it, or Judeans if you prefer, where it's about Jesus and equality with God and things like that. And I think that is fairly clearly reflective of later traditions about Jesus that were not present in the earlier traditions. If it was present in the earlier material, we'd find it in the Synoptic Gospels. It's not. So I think we can make the negative point in a number of cases fairly easily, I think. The trickier part is trying to talk about and think about earlier materials. And I've given the example, I may as well just build on the examples I've given. So in Mark chapter 2, 23 through to 28, and the plucking of the grain on the Sabbath, I've said this looks like it's reflective of Jewish debates about what can and can't be done on the Sabbath, whether it's acceptable to pluck grain or not. This isn't against any biblical law. This isn't against any biblical Sabbath law. It's within the range of the kind of debates we know in early Judaism about what was acceptable and what was not. For instance, there's a rabbinic debate about picking up fruit fallen from the tree. One group of Jews say it's okay, another group of Jews say it's not okay. So these are the kind of debates that we know about. And it's not the kind of debates, as far as we know, it's not the kind of debates that the early Christian movement, again, I'm using Christian as a term of convenience here, the early Christian movement was concerned about. So when we get to Paul's letters or whatever, the debate is whether to observe the Sabbath at all. What do you do with Gentiles and things like this? And we have these kinds of traditions, I think, that I think probably predate Paul. Now, Matthew builds on these, and fairly obviously with certain polemics, but I think he also reflects some of these disputes already taking place in early Christianity about whether the law needs to be observed or not. But there are certain traditions, particularly in Mark, I think, that assume that these are just simply internal Jewish debates. There's other things you can bring in here, and I'm skeptical on the whole about about the criteria, but including some of the use of Aramaic in reconstruction. But sometimes Mark has, and we get this in the Synoptic tradition, we have things like, I think fairly clear examples of Aramaic idiom. So in Mark 27 through to 28, it talks about humankind being made for the Sabbath, and the Son of Man is therefore Lord of the Sabbath, which looks like an idiomatic use of the Aramaic form of Son of Man, something equivalent to a man in my position, or someone like me, or something like this. Sort of a generic reference, but with reference to the individual. That that it doesn't really work in Greek. It looks to me and others like it's a fairly direct translation of an Aramaic idiom. But Matthew and Luke, when they use that tradition, make sure that Son of Man is a title for Jesus. It's no longer this generic reference to human being or whatever. It's the Son of Man. Jesus is the authority. So we can start combining things together like this to suggest that we may be dealing with early traditions. And the example I gave of purity, for instance, we've got very particular traditions concerning Jewish purity law, which have got no interest for Gentiles. I mean, Gentiles are just simply beyond questions of Jewish purity law. They just don't matter in these kinds of questions. And we do have traditions about purity. Why? I would suggest that some of these traditions are due to simply coming from that part of the world, and so the gospel writers and the gospel traditions had to deal with them. Again, I can't prove what Jesus said or didn't say or anything like that, but I think I can suggest that these kinds of traditions are early. And we could do this with a few other different things as well, but Jesus and the law is one close to my heart.
Does what is referred to as the synoptic problem play a role at all in reconstructing the historical Jesus, or should that be regarded as a separate matter?
No, it shouldn't be regarded as a separate matter, but I don't think it's the be all and end all of debates about the historical Jesus. So I mean, there will be issues about whether you believe in some form of Q or not, or versus one of the alternatives and so on. I still think I would come out with a similar portrait of the early material, irrespective of what I thought of Q, because I'd still be working on the principles I've just talked about. And even then, I mean, you do lapse into it one way or another. You can't wholly avoid it. I think with some of the traditions in Matthew 23 and Luke 11, for instance, about washing cups and things like this, that I think there's some good indications of shared Aramaic source, for instance, and some explanations of the differences between Matthew and Luke can be explained with reference to an Aramaic word, and that's an old argument, and I don't think it's been, despite the best efforts of some, I don't think it's really been debunked. So you get drawn into those kinds of questions, but generally speaking, I think you could make a case like that we make about socioeconomic issues in Galilee at the time Jesus is growing up and so on. I mean, irrespective of which view of the synoptic, which mainstream view of the synoptic problem you take. So yes, of course, it's going to impinge on it, but I think it can also be good to try to bypass some of the particularities and stop getting bogged down in those details, because that's, again, becomes one of those issues that becomes very difficult to prove. Someone once said to me, if I was ever going to write a book on the historical Jesus, please don't write a chapter on your view of method and the synoptic problem, because I'm just not going to read it. Now, I don't know if that was fair or not, but I get to coin an idiom, I get the fatigue.
Does Josephus, the first century Jewish historian, help us understand at all the historical Jesus, or at least the context that he's put in?
I think it's the second part that's great. I mean, whatever we make of Josephus's reference, or perhaps even alleged reference to Jesus, even if all that's true, it doesn't make any significant difference. And I don't think any of the material that you get in Roman sources, for instance, the Tacitus reference, I don't think this makes any difference whatsoever. I mean, this sort of material works with the assumption that there is a movement that we call Christianity that had a founder called Jesus, and that's sort of assumed at this end of first century or whatever. So that doesn't, I don't think it tells us anything really, other than that there was a movement at the end of the first century that had a founder figure called Jesus. So unless we get proper detailed biographical or related kind of ideas about Jesus coming from different sources, I don't think that stuff is that useful for the historical Jesus. Now, the second part of the question, I think, was more important in this respect, the context. Now, we've got we face problems with Josephus in relation to reconstruction, just as we face problems with the Gospels in relation to reconstruction. So all that duly acknowledged. But Josephus is obviously very helpful, cautiously used for understanding the political context, for instance, and the role of certain social movements in the time of Jesus, or thereabouts. It provides some very useful material for context like that. Now, again, as I said, historical reconstruction is a problem, and I think it's important to have to work through that. But we shouldn't get too bogged down that either. What we've got with Josephus as well are ideas about how certain things were perceived, about how you construct the world, about how a Jewish person very familiar with that part of the world would understand certain concepts. So I'm kind of interested in the concept of banditry, for instance, and it may be possible to reconstruct the historical bandit here and there, or the historical bandit movement, and so on. But so also the way Josephus understands what a bandit is also important, because these are the ideas in the air. These are the ideas of how people understand these things are as important as trying to find out the sort of factual detail about these kinds of people. So Josephus does give plenty of indication of the kind of circumstances that lead to these kinds of figures. He gives an indication of how they were constructed in relation to messianic figures, for instance, or millenarian figures, however you want to label them, and the overlaps between the two. Now, Josephus is very negative about this, but you can, by and large, but you can see how these concepts are important in first century Jewish thought, and you can trace that back to how people were understanding and constructing millenarian figures, bandits, and whatnot in the first century. So you can do a number of things with the context. You can do trying to reconstruct the factual thing, but you can also do the idea of how do we how are people imagining the world and constructing these different types of figures around the time of Jesus. You can do that with Josephus, and I think he's a very important figure for doing so. I mean, really, realistically, this could be debated, I guess, but realistically, one of the best, if not the best, resource for trying to get a grasp on social movements at the time of Jesus, and certainly at the time of the Jesus tradition was developing anyway.
What led you to the conclusion that Jesus' movement were likely bandits and that Jesus was a kind of revolutionary?
Well, I would qualify that even further. I wouldn't go along the lines that they were bandits, but I think that the comparison is important. It's how do you let me go back a bit further still. So in Galilee, we can make some pretty interesting claims, I think, and significant claims about what it was like growing up for a person like Jesus, or for anyone around that time. We've got building projects in the rebuilding of Sepphoris, just up the road from Jesus, and the building of Tiberias. These take resources, as has long been pointed out, from the countryside. Some people would have benefited, some people would not, some people might have taken advantage, whatever. There'd be a range of reactions to this. We know from Josephus, at least, that gifts of land were given. People were moved from their lands when in the building of Tiberias, and this wouldn't have been uncommon, of course. It did change the world, and there are two obvious avenues of reaction for people at the time. One was banditry, and one was apocalypticism or millenarianism. They are different but similar. So banditry would typically take a more direct route at retribution for perceived wrongs. You attack the local leaders or whatever physically. You rob them and so on. Whereas apocalypticism would be a more fantastical view of retribution. God would intervene, or God's agent would intervene in the not too distant future and right the wrongs, make the world a better place, and put the right people in charge, and make sure that justice was dispensed, people were well fed, and etc. etc. Now, they are two obviously different models, but they're overlapping models in the sense that they are partly explicable as reactions to social circumstances, changing social circumstances. They provide a language or a vehicle or a movement for people to express discontent. I mean, apocalypticism does much more than that, of course, as well. It's not limited to these kinds of situations, but it's an option. It's the language that's available. But they're also overlapping concepts as well. I mean, they are thinking about, they are trying to express a way of change, of dealing with the wrongs in the world. Whether you agree with this or not is another matter, of course. And Josephus blurs them as well. He can see that there's overlaps between these two concepts as well. And think from the perspective of Roman power or local power, Antipas or whatever. Well, you see someone like John the Baptist in the desert with a big crowd. Do you want to be... The Romans and their lackeys are not that big into making neat distinctions between, are these people going to lead a violent revolution, or are they going to just wait for God to do it in the distant future? You can ask questions later if you want. You just deal with these problems. And I think it's quite significant that the whole passion, trial, and death of Jesus is complicated in terms of historical reconstruction, but Jesus ends up on a Roman cross, crucified with bandits, or with insurrectionists, revolutionaries, or however you want to translate that. Because if someone's going to preach that it's going to be the end of the Roman Empire, well, you just deal with them. You don't worry about the niceties of it from the perspective of power. So that's the way I would understand it in terms of revolutionary thinking, rather than was Jesus necessarily a revolutionary in the strict sense. Was he going to lead a band of revolutionaries to overtake Jerusalem and install a king there and then? No. Did he think... I doubt it, but you never know. Did he think God would intervene and do something like that? I think that's pretty clear from the early material as well, and from how things like the Book of Daniel would have been understood. So I think I think it's important not to confuse this with modern ideas of revolution. It's important not to even confuse this with certain ancient understandings of revolution, or get the right type of revolution. But it's a way of trying to understand how a movement emerges in its social and economic context. The vision may have been fantastical, misguided, or whatever you want to think, but it's explicable in its time, I think.
What do you think Jesus' goals were in life? What do you think he wanted to achieve?
Well, I mean, again, I'm going to use Jesus as a shorthand for the earliest ideas about him, just to make that disclaimer at the beginning. A number of things. I think on sort of a basic level, him and his movement were a representative of some of the discontents that were being felt in Galilee as he was growing up, with the building projects, with the displacement of lands and things like this. So it's striking that the language of alternative family is in there in the Jesus tradition. Remember, young men expect to be heads of household or whatever, and not taking on that role, but you get this alternative family. That's the language they're used to. This is the alternative they're providing in that kind of context. I think there's what we call, rather than a mission to the poor, a mission to the rich. I think the earliest material does have this idea that the rich should repent, should return back to the commandments, should stop misbehaving, should stop exploiting, or at least this is the perception, and give up the wealth and things like this, and some very hard sayings on wealth in the Synoptic tradition. And this idea of sin is about this as well. So it's the phrase sinner is, and this is in Jewish literature from the Hebrew Bible, from the Psalms right through to the Babylonian Talmud. So we're talking about a 1,000-year period. This term sinner is pretty consistent. It's about people perceived to be lawbreakers, people perceived to be outside your interpretation of the law. And whenever the socioeconomic status of these people is mentioned, is that they're oppressive, unpleasant, evil, rich people. And there is a tradition that these people are pretty much unredeemable. There's a pretty strong strand of that. You know what these people are like. They'll always exploit you. Don't bother associating with them because you know what will happen. So we get quite a lot of that in Jewish sources. There is another tradition, though, that you never know. You might be able to bring these back to the fold. It's they still could potentially be brought back to the fold. I think Jesus probably belongs to that Jewish tradition of trying to get them to give up the ways and things like this. And that's a quite strong theme, I think, in the gospel tradition, the early tradition. I think it's also probably a little bit of wishful thinking, and I think we get stories such as Luke's story about Zacchaeus giving up half his money, just trying to explain that. I think partly trying to explain that this wasn't wholly successful necessarily, but I think that's a key part of the aim. I mean, if you look at things like the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, if you look at the story of the eye of the needle, these are stark attacks on wealth, and there's not a mission to the poor, because I think it's simply assumed that the poorer members, sections of society, however Jesus conceived them, were saved. It's a stark warning to rich people to change their ways. So in the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, the reason why the rich man suffers is because he's rich, and the reason why Lazarus is saved is because he had bad things in his life, poor things in his life. Same with the eye of the needle. These are very stark sayings, which I think get modified as Christianity develops. And already in the early tradition, there's an interesting class mixture. I mean, there seems to be connections with women of some resources to fund this movement, and people of some resources as part of this mission to the rich and part of giving up wealth. But I think the pragmatics of it probably soon came into play when people weren't going to be giving up the wealth so easily. So there's that side of it as well. And tied in with all this is this millenarianism about change your ways soon, the end of the world. Oh, not the end of the world. That's probably the wrong phrase to use. You know what I mean? The great transformation of society is coming, and you'll suffer if you don't change your ways. So that's driving a lot of this. There's also the idea, I think, of a movement that's emerging from a peasant context, or what we call a peasant context, an agrarian context, where you're trying to justify as many people from just regular Galilean workers to these repentant sinners. How do you include them in? And I think some of Jesus' understanding of the law is like that. His understanding of purity is like that. It's reflective of, I think, a fairly broad understanding of purity law in Galilee at the time, associated with rural workers who were not able or not willing to keep other stricter aspects of purity law, for instance. But this is never understood as going against any biblical law. It was simply another debate about purity. But I think it was an understanding of purity that comes from a peasant context. And I think a lot of the legal material is like that, including plucking of the grain, incidentally. So I think a lot of it is driven by what's happening in Galilee, the aims of this early material, and you can interpret a lot of the traditions in light of these shifting socioeconomic circumstances and the hopes for transformation in the future. So when this transformation comes, I think it's also important to say that the aims are not egalitarian in the sense that we would understand, but it's an idealized view of what the world should be like. That's going to happen again. There will be an ideal king. There will be Jesus and the 12 judging and so on and so forth. There will be a hierarchy, but it'll be a benign hierarchy, is the understanding, that will dispense justice as it should be dispensed, and people will be provided for. We will get rid of the corrupt elite and provide a proper hierarchy, and this is emerging from a context of peasant hierarchies and things like that. And I don't think it's a utopianism that's still hierarchical and structured, and I think some of that old romantic stuff, what's still present in the 80s and 90s historical Jesus studies, I think has got to go, and we've got to understand this idea of millenarianism as something that would have been thought of as credible in a first century peasant context, and not one that's necessarily credible in a post 60s, mildly hippie-ish academic context, if I can put it that way.
Do you think Jesus found himself in conflict with the Jewish high priesthood and other Jewish authorities? If he, if yes, is it? Do you think it could have been because it's connected to opposition to the high priesthood as being a corrupted priesthood, and he thinks that they're not following the Torah, just as other Jews protested them and think and they thought the same thing.
Yeah, I think there's a chance of some. Some of this is some of the debates about the law. I think are not unusual. Let's put it that way. And they could get heated. A lot of debates could get heated and beyond heated, and even violent sometimes. But rabbinic law's got loads of disputes about the law. The Dead Sea Scrolls clearly show some pretty heated disputes between the law, between different Jewish factions and things like that. And so it's certainly very plausible that Jesus got involved in those sorts of disputes. And I think a lot of the early material is about these internal disputes over interpretation of the law. The issue of the high priest or the priesthood is an interesting one. I think that again is certainly a possibility. The temple action could be understood in these terms, and I think that's what Mark is driving at. At least Mark is driving at anyway. He's the focus of Mark's account is on the money changers and dove sellers, and whether or not, I mean, exploitation can also, I mean, I don't want to downplay exploitation at all, but it can also be a matter of perception. So whether the priests and the high priest saw themselves as being corrupt and exploitative is one thing, whether their opponents did is another. So you do get a tradition of opposition to the to at least the priesthood, or at least aspects of the priesthood and the high priest being corrupt and exploiting the poor and so on. And I think if Mark's account of the temple dispute is in that tradition, I would argue. I think it's fairly clearly in that tradition that it's in its own extension of this idea that wealth corrupts and so on and so forth. So I think it's certainly possible. Whether it's how we link this to the wider mission, was it absolutely geared towards exposing the high priest and all this? Well, I think we'd have a lot more material on that if that were the case. I could see it coming to the possibility that it could come to a head in Jerusalem at Passover and things like that, and then things spiral out of control for all parties. So I think there's quite it's not a reasonable argument to say that this is there in the early material in relation to Jesus and the priesthood and the high priest. There's something there. Whether it was the driving force behind it, that's a different question, and I'm not so sure about that. Even so, the result of that, and this could be a combination of intention, accident, or whatever, and big crowds at Passover, is that Jesus ends up on a cross at Passover because of the temple incident, at least according to Mark and his earliest copiers, which doesn't have to be. I mean, that's where it gets complicated, I think. I mean, if the authorities in Jerusalem, whether Jewish, Roman, or whatever, are seeing someone causing problems at Passover, which could lead to a riot, it's not surprised that this person ends up on a cross. So I think there's something there. Quite how we frame it in terms of the extent of the disputes is not straightforward, because there are a lot of very heated disputes over the law, and I don't think Jesus' arguments with the Pharisees, at least portrayed in the gospel traditions, I don't think they're that unusual in early Judaism, but they could get very heated. So I appreciate that's not a definitive answer, but I don't think we can be too definitive about it. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. So do you think that Jesus was crucified because he could have been an apocalypticist, and even though he wasn't a revolutionary as like we view revolutionaries in the modern world, do you think he could have been seen as threat enough to have been crucified as he was?
Oh yeah, I think that's fairly straightforward in one sense. Is for all the complexity of trying to reconstruct what's going on behind the passion narrative or passion narratives, is a simple point. Someone does something in the temple, someone ends up crucified. Um, now that the level of intention is an interesting question. Did he do it on purpose to provoke his death? Difficult to answer. Did he think he would die in Jerusalem? Well, he must have had some inclination of this, given what happened to John the Baptist. I mean, any figure with a following preaching that the Roman Empire would soon be replaced must have known that that they'd be put to death. I mean, I think that's would have been fairly common sense for any such figure in the first century. So there is that. Now, so this is what I'm saying. It's difficult to put to the level of in trying to explain the absolute pure intentions of somebody, but these ideas, the idea that you're expecting a kingdom to replace the Roman Empire, or an empire, or a dictatorship, or theocracy to replace the currently existing order, is going to potentially cause trouble if you say it in the wrong time, the wrong place. You say this at Passover with the retelling the story of the Exodus from Egypt and the overthrow, defeat of Pharaoh and all this kind of thing, and the hope and expectations that this would happen again, then you've got an issue. And with the crowds at Passover and the support that Jesus seems to have at Passover, then again, you've got some serious social and political problems at hand. And the idea from that general setting that someone causing a disturbance in the temple with those kinds of levels of support or potential for a riot, believing that the Roman Empire would be overthrown, even if he thinks God would do the dirty work or a divine agent would do the dirty work or whatever, then it's not a massive surprise that this person ends up dead, crucified or whatever. As I said, it happened to John the Baptist. It would happen to others like Theodos afterwards, not necessarily crucified, obviously, but beheading or whatever alternative. It doesn't matter if these figures are physically violent in the present or expecting someone to do someone divine to do the work. They'll deal with them. That's just the nature of settling these disputes in the ancient world. You had to be nuanced about it sometimes. At Passover, it was a particularly dangerous time to do this because of what if Jesus had high levels of popular support? There could be a riot. So there's real concerns, and we see the popularity of John the Baptist, at least in Josephus's account of the death of John the Baptist and his aftermath. Jews still thinking that Antipas gets punished for killing John the Baptist. So these figures and are popular, and in Josephus's account of them at least, and we get this in Acts as well. There may be a relationship there, so that again is another problem for another time. But they are described as popular movements, as in they have a big following of people. So it's something that has to be dealt with carefully, but you don't want a big following coming into Jerusalem and causing problems. So what do? You kill the leader, or you kill the leader and the figures around them. That put that together collectively all makes sense to me.
Why do you think it was believed Jesus rose from the dead after his crucifixion?
Well, because I think I've been quite skeptical about reconstructing early material, but I think oddly one of the things I'm most confident on is that people thought they saw the resurrected Jesus early on. So from Paul's account in 1 Corinthians, obviously, it looks like Paul's got traditions handed on to him and so on. So I think we can make a fairly good, clear case that people thought they saw Jesus risen from the dead. What that involved, we can't be too sure at all, I don't think, because Paul doesn't give us the full details of what these kinds of experiences involve. Whether they thought they saw the physical body or not, I mean, I think it's entirely possible they thought they saw the physical body of Jesus. And in cross culture, these things happen. These things happen. People think they see people risen from the dead, or visions, or whatever. And there is behind this is also a tradition that martyrs will be vindicated. They will get the bodies back and things like this. They will be vindicated with some kind of existence after life, and so on and so forth. There's a strong tradition there behind that, and you put that together, it's explicable that people thought that Jesus was risen from the dead. So that becomes an important moment, at least in the continuity of the movement. Going beyond that, I don't think we can say too much. And we haven't really. I mean, it depends what we think of the accounts of the resurrection. Were these accounts that might have reflected something like visionary accounts? Well, that it's possible that these are the kinds of things people saw or claim to have seen. But I mean, it's very difficult to verify those kinds of questions. Maybe they saw bright lights or whatever, a bit like Paul's vision on the road to Damascus. I don't know. But clearly, I think we can make the very simple point that people believe they saw the risen Jesus. And I've no reason to doubt that people thought that was the case early on after the death of Jesus. So that's an important moment, and one that it's not wholly surprising. I don't think in that context.
Last question. Could you tell us what the deal is about the so-called Jesus boat?
No. This is where you need Robert Miles. He's into that kind of thing. I think, as far as I understand this, and you would have to ask Robert on this more than me.
Maybe we could talk about it a little bit more next time we get together.
Okay, yeah, but it's more to do with a boat that would have been around the time of Jesus rather than there's a boat Jesus was on. Is the
right? I understood that when I read the book.
Yeah. But Robert's into fishing and things like that, and boats and sea. And good on him. I mean, I think actually there is a point for me. The important takeout from all the stuff on fishing and networks like that are actually pretty crucial, because the fishing networks give you the fishing networks are important for the spread of the message, as are the connections with more elite groups, elite women, tax collectors, the combination of tax collectors and fishing, of course, as well. These are important early networks for the spread of the movement. And we see when we get to the book of Acts how the movement spreads in slightly different ways through synagogues, households, and things like this. I think we might be able to make some claims that these fishing, tax collectors, elite women networks were important for the spread of them, and I should add scribal networks as well, which are also intertwined with this, were a part of the importance of spreading the movement as beyond simply a local peasant millenarian movement to something that will become far bigger in the long run.
Well, thanks for joining me today, Professor Crossley.
It's all right. Pleasure.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell, and if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.